Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Oh, this is coming off again. Is this on? No. Okay. All right. All right. Well, I think we're about to start. So, oh, this is on too. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings and the mercy of God upon all of you. Standard Muslim greeting. I don't know if the Zoom attendees are yet connected, but we are live in the internet, on YouTube, and on the Facebook Live video of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project's Facebook page, and also on X, on my account there, at Adnan A. Hussein. So welcome to everybody who's attending online, either through the Queen's University Zoom. Hopefully you're coming in at some point soon, and also to everybody else out there who is attending on the other platforms. We're going to be starting in just a couple of minutes, and they'll insist on saying a nice introduction, I'm sure, for me, and then we'll get into the real discussion. So thank you everyone for your patience and for coming. It should just be a couple of minutes before the program officially begins. Sure, yeah. This one? Yeah. Right.
Can everyone on the Zoom hear? If you're listening through YouTube. Yeah. Okay. Do you want to start at like 7:10, or do you want to start?
Oh, let's go ahead and start. Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as you think people are on over there.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.
May the peace and blessings and mercy of God be upon you all. My name is Nuh. It's an Arabic name. I'm a second-year medical student here at Queen's. Most of my friends at QMed call me Nu, which makes sense because it's kind of a hard name to pronounce. Some of my friends here at QMed call me Noor. I respond to all three. So usually at the beginning of these talks, there's this dry promotional information that's shared that usually is a bit boring. So I won't bore you with details like the fact that this was put together by the Muslim Medical Association of Queens, in addition to the Queen's University MSA, as well as the What Happened in Medicine Interest Group, along with the Muslim Society's Global Perspective Academic Initiative at Queens. Those are details I told myself in the interest of time I would not be sharing with you all tonight. So I won't. Before we get into the speaker, I just want to share one small excerpt that I read recently in al-tabib al-nabawi, the prophetic medicine by Ibn al-Qayyim, in which Ibrahim or Abraham is talking to God, and he says, Ya Rabbi mimman idda. He says, Oh my Lord, from who does sickness come from? And Allah then responds, Minni. He says, from me. And then Ibrahim then asks, Famimman iddawa. He says, from who does cure come from? And then God responds, Minni. He says, from me. And then Ibrahim or Abraham asks, Fama bal al-tabib. He says, so what is the role of the physician? And then Allah or God responds, Rajulun ursilu dawa'a ala yadayhi. That it's the person that transmits the cure. And this is just a short, concise example of how Muslims view the physician-patient relationship in a spiritual aspect. And it really sets a precedent for how Muslims view the field of medicine. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speaker. We're very happy to have Dr. Adnan Hussain, who is the director of the School of Religion, as well as an associate professor in history, focusing on intercultural and interreligious relations, and looks at history as well as anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism. And he has a YouTube channel as well as the Guerrilla History podcast. So please help me give the warmest of welcomes to Dr. Adnan Hussain.
Okay, thank you so much, Noor, for that kind introduction. To all of you coming out tonight on a rainy, starting to be a little cold day. So that takes some himma, some kind of determination and energy, for which, I applaud you and commend you. And also I want to thank the Muslim students, the Muslim Medical Students Association, Queen's University Muslim Students Association, and I finally now know what the acronym stands for, What Happened in Medicine. And I want to thank that group and society as well for sponsoring this talk, which is in commemoration of Islamic History Month. Every October is Islamic History Month. Some of you may have known that. Some of you this may be the first time you've heard of Islamic History Month, but it's an initiative that's been taking place and recognized in Canada for at least 12, 14 years, and every year we try and hold some kind of set of events about Islamic history. And this year we already had one talk with a dear uncle, kind of elder of this community, Murray Hogben, who is a historian and an author and formerly a journalist, and his talk perfectly fit the theme this year for Islamic History Month, which was about Muslims in Canada, and he's written a book about Muslims who came, in the pre-1968 era, that being the period when immigration policy in Canada changed and greater numbers of Muslims came in subsequent to this 1968 change in the immigration policy. My talk today is really not so closely related to that theme. It's really about a distant past. And I want to say right off that I am not an expert in the history of science or the history of medicine. In particular, I do study pre-modern Islamic culture and civilization, and in particular interactions between, as Nuh mentioned, Muslims, Christians, and Jews. So I don't want to claim to be, particularly knowledgeable and expert in the field of medical ethics. But when invited by the Medical Students Association to talk about something related to Islam, Islamic societies, and something relevant to medical students in the history of medicine, I decided that a book that had been brought to my attention called the Adab al-tabib, Kitab adab al-tabib, the book on the adab, and we'll get into what is the translation. I put conduct in the title, conduct of the physician, and the subject of early Islamic and Islamicate. We'll talk about what do I mean by that in due course. Kind of medical ethics, or thinking about the practices and conduct and proper behavior procedures, what one might call perhaps best practices of the medieval physician in Muslim-governed societies. And in particular, this book was brought to my attention by a former student of mine who is now a teacher and a librarian, and he was cataloging at University of Ottawa various books in medical history and science, and he came across a reference to this Kitab adab al-tabib and thought that I'd be interested. So I have to thank John Conklin for putting me onto this, all to say that I am very recent to the field of thinking about medical ethics. And when I consider medical ethics in the contemporary world, we think really about standards of ethical behavior, how you should, as a physician, treat your patients, issues about confidentiality, issues about, research and what you can and shouldn't, can and cannot, responsibly research, and in what ways, what are those practices. And in general, we tend to think of these as precise questions and problems about particular matters and whether they're ethical or not. And what I discovered in starting to investigate the field of early Islamic ethics is that the approach was totally different. They didn't start with the phenomenon of a problem and a question about whether it's allowable to do a precise thing. Can you clone, or there's a lot of questions that come up with new biotechnologies. Are they, transgressing boundaries of, social ethics in society and not? And very often we think about these as a conflict between technology and social concerns and the control of and rapid spread of new technology. So we look at the phenomenon, a problem, and then we say, oh, is it, right to do it this way or not? And then try and bring some ethical kinds of concerns and questions to bear on a precise question. What I discovered is that in these early treatises, perhaps they don't fit into what we think about as ethics. What they were most concerned about with really is the formation of the physician. What kind of person and character? So it led to this kind of question. We tend to think of medical ethics as application of principles to precise questions and phenomena, and they're about professional questions. And it doesn't mean that the physician themselves has to do anything other than adhere to a standard, set of principles and ethics, right? It doesn't matter if the physician is a good person or not, according to standard, kind of medical ethics. That's not really what's at stake or the question. So there's really a big, profound difference. Does a physician have to have a moral formation or be an ethical person in their life to be an ethical physician? right? This is a kind of question. And I think that, or is medical ethics just a professional code of conduct to guide their behavior and inform decisions on their practice? All those things that we were talking about. Their relationship with their patients, how to do that in an appropriate way, how to keep confidentiality, what do you do with medical, all those kinds of questions. Those don't require somebody to be any kind of a person other than one who's willing to adhere to a professional code of conduct, right? And this is something that's completely different in the early Islamicate society, is that somebody like the author of this book, Ishaq ibn Ali al-Ruhawi, was more concerned with the question of how a physician and the responsibility of a physician to be an ethical, moral, properly educated person themselves. And that if you achieved that, then a lot of these other problems would be solved, or they would be able to apply principles, they would be able to restrain, because the problem was seen as restraining oneself from kind of the temptation to take a shortcut, to do what's easier, to tell patients or people what they wanted to hear when it wasn't the best medical advice in order to achieve reward, to go into the field of medicine seeking worldly benefit rather than a larger kind of concern and regard for serving humanity, right? So from the perspective of from al-Ruhawi, the main kind of question was thinking about what is the best way for a physician to behave and be as a person. And in fact, he didn't see a distinction or a difference between the kind of code of conduct you might have in your professional life and the kind of person you are. So that was a very big realization that I wanted to start with. When we get into some of the details, we'll see how, his discussion about what is the proper conduct or adab of a physician and what the sort of concerns are. But that's something I wanted to highlight as a real distinction and a difference. Now, the one way to make sense of this is that different aspects of forms of knowledge in this era were seen as very closely and intimately interrelated as an organic unity. They weren't separate fields of, there may be specializations, avenues that you would go through deeply, but at a larger, kind of more general level, all the different forms of knowledge in the mind of, people who were people of learning during this age were intimately and organically connected in a unity. They weren't separated. So ethics and knowledge about how the body worked, these things actually were coordinated. They were integral to one another. Knowledge of what we would think of as humanities and social science, of literature, of philosophy, wasn't something that was seen as profoundly and of its nature different or uninvolved with science, material science, study of the body, study of the physical world and natural world. These were actually integrated in their understanding of the forms of knowledge. And so in that sense, it makes more sense, it should make more sense to us that he didn't divide, for example, ethics from kind of physical knowledge of anatomy, right? He saw these things as intimately related. Okay, and the last thing that I wanted just at the outset, before telling us a little bit more about him and about what he discussed in his text, is also to say that in scholarship that has looked back at the history of medical ethics for Muslims today, getting back to what, I talked a little bit about generally what comes to mind about medical ethics today. There's also what comes to mind for Muslims who are pious Muslims who are seeking some kind of guidance and, basis for determining, how they should think about things like cloning or, new technologies in medicine or practices, or autopsy was a big, thing in the pre-modern period. Could you do an autopsy, or was this somehow going to spoil the body and prevent it from, being integral in the afterlife? There were a lot of prohibitions and concerns that people had. So the question is how did people find guidance then and how today? In today's world, it seems that Muslims have subjected their entire understanding of Islam and the ethical kind of basis of it through law, through what we think of as Sharia. However, I don't think law is actually the best translation for Sharia, because Sharia is a much more encompassing body of how do you live according to God's guidance and His will in this world, right? That's essentially what it is. Law is actually only a small component of it. Law brings out the idea that there are norms that are enforceable and that there is some kind of method and mechanism of enforcement. When you're talking about law in the modern period, we always think of political units, municipal ordinances, state or provincial legislative, laws that have been now enacted, or federal laws enforced by the government. And what we're speaking about in the context of early Muslim societies in the first 2, 3, 4 centuries of the Islamic, of Muslim societies, that wasn't the kind of regime in which people lived their lives and practiced their religion through an idea that there is law that will be enforced by the state. That wasn't the reality. Firstly, because for 2 reasons. One is because in the pre-modern era, states were incredibly weak. They couldn't enforce much, okay? They didn't have the techniques of governing, of controlling, of regulating, of surveilling, of collecting information, of funding and empowering, forms of, public legal, order, of police, etc. These were very underdeveloped in the pre-modern period. In fact, actually, we live in an incredibly regulated sort of era, right? And the nature of political power was much more limited. It may have been more violent because you couldn't enforce the law and get everyone to follow the law, in the ways that we've all been trained to, educated to do so. But it just meant that the reality was the state wasn't very intrusive in daily life. People had to make decisions about what they thought they should do, how they should behave, that were based on a much more amorphous set of, ethical and, shari'i, in this kind of religious ordinances. It wasn't that you were afraid that if you do this, that the, state, will come and find out about it and do something to you. That was far less, possible in that period. The second reason why we have to really think about and imagine a difference between law and ethics, and not law in the kind of contemporary way we think about law, is because attempts by rulers and governors in the past during this period to impose their religious views on matters of belief, on matters of Sharia, were highly contested. And in fact, the people who had a much stronger kind of acknowledged power in society to actually, make rulings and pronouncements about how people should live their lives, how they should, contract their marriages, how they should, disperse their estates upon their death, etc., were people who were religious scholars and specialists of, what were called the, religious sciences, right? Those were the people that people turned to, and in fact, they managed to have so much more social authority that attempts by rulers to do so, and there's very famous accounts of, for example, the Caliph al-Ma'mun, who was the son of Harun al-Rashid, a more famous, perhaps, figure that you may have heard of. attempted to establish that anybody who wanted to be an official witness in the courts or a judge to make legal rulings for people who brought cases before them would have to adhere to a certain position on belief that he was supporting. And he attempted to enforce that. He failed. He was unable to enforce it because the populace didn't recognize the authority of the caliph to intervene on matters of belief. And they turned instead to the people who had acknowledged authority from people because they had studied the texts of the Quran, the Hadith, the other religious sources. So when we think of translating Sharia into law in a modern sense, we make a big mistake if we imagine that what that meant was that there was a whole apparatus of state power enforcing norms and laws the way that happens today in our legal environment. It was a much more diffuse, collective, communal, and individual set of decisions that guided people in how they behaved. Okay, so when we think today that these questions about biomedical ethics and so on have to be determined through Sharia, that whether something is allowable or not allowable and forbidden, whether something is allowed but maybe, considered unpreferred, right? There's a whole set of these gradations, in Islamic Sharia that determines what, the disposition of any act, that it can be placed within a kind of paradigm of whether it's enjoined that you must do it, it's obligatory, or forbidden and everything in between, right? These different gradations. However, what I would argue and suggest is that that isn't in itself necessarily the best way, the only way in which Muslims tried to solve questions of what's the right thing to do and how to determine that. And so that's where we look to this body of literature called adab. This is not Islamic law, but it is kind of considered the proper conduct, the proper behavior, and the proper, what we might say, best practices that existed in society and the culture. And these were developed by people who were practitioners themselves. So this figure who I mentioned, the author of the Adab al-tabib, the conduct of the physician, Ishaq ibn Ali al-Ruhawi, was himself, as we know, a practicing doctor. And if we read his text, he tells us actually quite a lot about cases that he himself had. So we know that he had long experience. The place where he seems to be from, Ruhawi, that is somebody from Ruha, is modern day Urfa in Turkey, and it was known also historically as Edessa. So it's in what might be considered, today it's in the nation state of Turkey, but it would have been considered something like northwestern Mesopotamia, right? In that region. All these like countries, Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, these are all kind of modern constructs and didn't exist in the same boundaries or in the same form, in the past. So when we say he was from what is today Urfa or Edessa, that's how he would have been known. He wouldn't have been known as somebody from Iraq or Turkey, right? So that's important also to remember. So he was, very little is actually known about him, but we know a little bit about what Urfa or Edessa was like during this period. It was a very mixed place that had a lot of Christians, a variety of different Christians, some Syriac Christians, as well as Greek Orthodox Christians, a large community of Jews, and of course Muslims by the time that he is writing, which is in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Islamic era, or the 8th and 9th centuries of the kind of common era. And in fact, there is some controversy over his religious identity. We don't know that much about this figure. Some people argue that he was a Jew. Others say he was a Christian. Others say he converted to Islam. Others say he was born a Muslim and always remained a Muslim. And from his text, it wouldn't be that easy to really determine that. And that's, I think, an interesting point and an interesting question, which is why I call this Islamicate origins rather than Islamic origins or Muslim origins of medical ethics. And the reason why is because the practice and the study of medicine, like many other forms of knowledge, whether they were mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and even theology, I would argue, which you would think would have to be very defined by the religion. I mean, how are you supposed to have a conversation and study, belief systems of a religion if you're not all part of the same religion? Well, in point of fact, there was a whole body of kind of comparative theology that developed in the mixed, heterogeneous, and cosmopolitan cities of the Islamic world that included Jews, Christians, Muslims, and so forth, right? So medicine was no different in that somebody like Hunayn ibn Ishaq, one of the most famous kind of scholars of this era, was a Christian scholar who knew Syriac and was very involved in translating Greek philosophical, medical, and other scientific texts into Arabic, because he had learned Arabic, he knew Syriac, and he knew Greek, and so he, translated texts from Aristotle and from Galen and others into Arabic. And among his students, he had many Muslim students. And so what we have is a kind of practice of knowledge, of study, and a culture of science and of learning and of knowledge that was interreligious. And so that's why I call it Islamicate, because you might have a Christian teacher of Muslim students who teach, and those Muslim students go on to teach Jewish students who all perpetuate and continue, knowledge in the discipline that they're studying, whether it's medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and so forth. And so Islamicate just gives us, the sense that it's happening under Muslim governorship and rule, and often the patronage of Muslim sovereigns. And so, for example, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who I mentioned, was a major translator of Aristotle into Arabic. He was patronized by al-Ma'mun, the son of Harun al-Rashid, who, was a great patron of translation and of learning. And, we have all of these accounts and stories of the Beit al-Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, which was maybe a library and a place where scholars gathered and conducted, research and teaching and learning. And again, it was an interreligious, interfaith kind of project of extending knowledge under Muslim kind of patronage. Like the ruler was a Muslim and wanted to see this happen. So he endowed fellowships, scholarships, rewarded scholars, funded their research, and so forth. Okay, so, but I do want to get, I will come back to this question of the religious identity of this figure, and, why it's maybe in some ways not even the best question, when we look at actually his text and, what might be shared across different religious communities when it comes to the proper conduct of the physician. Okay, so I should, we started a little late, but I should, probably, get into at least some of the specifics here of why and how his text is so different in some ways from what we might expect of a modern treatise on, or discussion or book on medical ethics. For one thing, he says, no physician, and this is something maybe people today would contest. He said, no physician really can travel this path without believing and having faith in God. Like it's absolutely necessary. And this is kind of an interesting statement, given that physicians were very closely associated with philosophy. As I said, these were very integrated forms of knowledge. And so if you think about who are some of the most famous philosophers in the Islamic world from this era, people like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, as he's known in Latin when his works are translated into Latin, and his medical textbook was used until the 18th century in Europe. Okay, so this is a 9th century scholar, 9th, 10th century scholar whose work, lasted for hundreds of years as core of the medical curriculum. Like if you were studying to be a doctor, in the year 1200, 1300, whether you were in the Islamic world or you were in Europe, you were basically reading Avicenna and other works, but Ibn Sina was crucial. He's also known as one of the most important philosophers of the time. Al-Farabi, also an important philosopher, was a doctor, was a medical doctor. Some of the most famous and important mathematicians were also doctors. So there were people who were involved in multiple disciplines at this time. It wasn't seen that you had to only specialize in one over the other, and that's because the form and understanding of knowledge actually integrated these things together in an important way. So when he says, and usually some of these people who were dedicated to science, and we tend to think of science as a kind of secular endeavor, the way it's framed and studied in the contemporary university environment as a secular endeavor where, it's separated from questions of metaphysical belief. This is a period where somebody who might have been philosophically oriented and very dedicated to what we might think of as a materialist understanding of the natural world and the function of the human body, somebody who was dedicated to investigation and experimentation, nonetheless felt that it was absolutely important that the formation of a physician be rooted in a profound ethical religious core of belief, because he couldn't really see or imagine a basis for ethics without a religious culture. And he says very clearly throughout many times, in this text, that you have to turn towards the books, the divine books. And it's interesting. He doesn't say the Quran or the Bible. He says the divine, books, the divine laws that have come down. His audience seems to be maybe, an interreligious audience, right? Where the important point for him is that you be grounded in your faith and that your morals and your ethical content and commitments come from being rooted in, belief. So that's kind of an important and interesting sort of difference from that period, despite the fact that he was somebody who was dedicated to philosophy and to science. A second kind of interesting point that I wanted to bring up is in the formation of the physician, is that he thought also that it was an important social role, okay, in society. And as a result, there were certain standards of respectability that you needed to maintain. So he gives extremely detailed advice in his kind of best practices advice to physicians as they develop, to be concerned with things like their grooming, their personal grooming. They should wear clean clothes and be respectable. They should groom themselves carefully so that they don't look unkempt and are represent. And he's arguing that they're representing both the profession of physicians and their kind of social role in society, but also that it's very important, to actually inculcate trust in the society around you. And it seems that he is quite sensitive to a period where there's a lot of potential criticism, for physicians, because if a patient dies, the physician is always going to be blamed during this sort of period, and that there is a need to kind of inculcate confidence in the rest of society that you are a very sober person with, serious characteristics. You shouldn't be caught, out like, attending, kind of low entertainments in the street and this sort of thing, but you should always be seen in the kind of sessions, the majalis, the sessions of the learned. And in fact, he even says you should go where people are discussing literature and philosophy, and you should be seen to be participating and engaged in those things and never be caught, hanging around in like the coffee, well, they didn't have coffee shops, but the equivalent of, kind of just being out in society, doing idle things for vain entertainments, or watching kind of street theater or jugglers, or, anything like this would be disreputable, and was very important for you to cultivate kind of a standard of respectability in the terms of in the terms and the way in which that was imagined, in the society, right? So he also is very concerned that doctors take care of their health, because if a doctor is unhealthy, then it undermines the authority of, the profession. That if you yourself can't, live a balanced, healthy life, then maybe your knowledge would be somewhat suspect. Okay, and so that's a kind of an interesting point that he really emphasizes and talks at great length about how you have to have a disciplined regime, take care of your body. He says you have to start your day with prayer, of course, but also you have to take care, brush your teeth, eat the right foods, not eat in excess, like heavy foods and these sorts of things that will undermine your health. And that, in essence, he thinks of the path of the physician as one of self-disciplined cultivation, in much the same way that the philosophers are always talking about the need for restraint, for control over your own passions and desires. And he sees that as not just a question of practices, but also the foundation of ethics and morals. Because, as I mentioned from the very beginning, if you are somebody who can't dedicate yourself to the path of knowledge and of discipline and moderation, and having good standards in the company that you keep and all of these kinds of things, then you are susceptible ethically and morally to flattering, rulers and your patients, to going after this worldly gain and doing, practicing your profession, which is, he argues it is the noblest of professions, for the sake of money and this worldly rewards, rather than a dedication to essentially a kind of ascetic life of service. He knows that you might be well rewarded, because everybody is concerned about their health, and the good doctors will be in demand by the wealthy and the powerful, and if they're successful in their treatment and care of others, of their patients, they may be very well rewarded. But he's very concerned that that not be, in fact, actually the motivation, because that could be a real source of corruption. And he, in fact, blames everybody who's writing during this period is always talking about how everything was better in the previous era and everything is in decline now. It's a kind of common refrain. And maybe we are not so far from that, today. We always, talk about how many changes are taking place in society and everything's going in a terrible direction, etc. And things were so much better in the past. So there's some romanticization. This is kind of an ideological position, that he has. But he identifies that one of the problems that has happened in contemporary practice of medicine is that unsuitable people who are not willing to restrain their own passions are going into this for the sake of rewards or fame and flattery, of others, and that this is the source for, one of the sources for the corruption of this kind of noble profession, which has to be held to a higher standard. And in fact, he actually has a whole section of his book on the need for examinations to ensure that doctors maintain a standard of education and knowledge on the one hand, to be able to practice, that they're fully educated in, the canons of medicine, but secondly, that they adhere to be, strictly examined, for their moral and ethical capacity, whether they're the kind of person who is doing this noble profession for the wrong reasons, and those people should be eliminated from the pool. And he, in fact, actually endorses the idea that one of the duties of the king or the sovereign is, in fact, actually to enforce, the standards of professionalism established by physicians themselves, to enforce this, and so to regulate, and make sure that only suitable people who are adhering to these high standards of ethics, should be practicing medicine. Okay, I want to make sure there's some time for further discussion. So I do want to, say is that he argues that physicians are not just people who cure the ills of the body and illness of the body. He argues he has two, I think, interesting different facets to what he imagines the role and duties and obligations of a physician are. One is maintaining health. Okay, so the best physician is one who inculcates and encourages people with his knowledge and with his or her knowledge and example, not to do things like overeating, eating foods that taste good but aren't good for you, behaving in ways that will, by not getting enough sleep and, kind of being out late at night and having irregular habits and all of this, is basically, his idea is that health is a kind of social sort of question of prevention and of leading a life that is designed to, to maintain and improve one's health, rather than just trying to treat disease. Okay, now I think in our modern medicine, typically the schooling and the education that has developed in the 20th century, things are maybe changing now a little bit, but it was about, a problem that's precise. You have this illness, these symptoms. How do you diagnose it? How do you treat it, right? And that's the way, the obligation of the physician. After that, that's over. Whereas he had a vision of the role of the physician that was much more an advocate of approach to health that was preventative, that was based on an ethics of moderation and healthy living, so that you would not fall ill in the first place. And that then, of course, if somebody's out of balance, and of course, the idea of balance, we are dealing with a Galenic humoral, kind of system, where there are four humors, and, the key is that they be balanced in an appropriate way, so that you, have, the kind of, constitution that is, in balance and therefore healthy. And if you have more of one or the other, and the qualities that go with them, that could undermine and damage health. So we might dispute, whether the particular physical, explanation for, health is accurate, obviously. But I think the principle, however, of being as equally concerned with the maintenance of health and a concept of health as living in a lifestyle, eating appropriate foods, and taking care of your body as important to health, is, I think, something that we are now starting to appreciate again more and more. The other interesting point is the relationship between what we might call the psychic and the physical, the body and the soul. He is quite convinced that everybody has both a soul and a body, and it isn't the job of the physician to be only concerned with the care of the body. But in fact, actually, the physician is very importantly concerned about the care of their own soul and of their patient's souls. The cultivation of a dedication towards truth, what he would call haqq, right? And to, what is correct and what is right is actually very important. He even talks a little bit about some psychic, maladies, that we might call depression or melancholia. And of course, they had an idea that there was a physical basis to that, with the colic, was one of the four humors, right? Black bile and yellow bile and so on. But what he's articulating in a way is a principle that how somebody is emotionally and psychically and in their kind of person and how they feel about themselves and others and about their situation in life can have a dramatic effect on whether they are, healthy and happy as a person. And he was concerned that care needs to be taken to the cultivation of the soul, so that what we would think of as psychological or psychic kinds of questions or problems don't also manifest in the undermining of health, and that the two, in fact, go together. And I think while we wouldn't adopt exactly the same paradigms of explanation and articulation and diagnosis, that principle nonetheless is something that maybe we are now appreciating more and more, that being a doctor isn't just about the few moments that you have the person in the treatment room, but it is understanding the whole person and really reflecting on how health is a much more holistic experience and phenomenon for the individual and in society. And we see a lot of precedent in this 9th century work, really articulating that we have to be concerned about the whole person as a person in order to really understand whether they're healthy and happy as well. So those were, I think, some things that are very different from how we've been taught health should be understood by medical professionals, but that nonetheless have some value even today, despite the progress of science, that there are ways in which sometimes that progress has come at a cost of understanding a more holistic perspective. And that's something we could return to some extent and integrate ourselves. And so I just want to conclude, and I could go into other details. He has a lot of interesting stories about, connecting the kind of tradition of reason, of like the kind of scientific knowledge that we would recognize, and what he calls prophecy. That there is also something, he thinks, in terms of the soul that can know and understand things in a different way than just through reason, that also should be incorporated and integrated. And he even has some stories, for example, about Galen having some dreams, that gave him insight into, a therapeutic technique and so on. And he says that, he had access in some ways because he was also, in addition to being an extraordinarily knowledgeable physician, he was an exemplar of this moral kind of ethical cultivation and perfection as well, that gave him access to forms of understanding and insight that wouldn't just come during normal kinds of study, but that were part of his whole person, that he had a kind of awareness that gave him more insight than other doctors, right? So it's interesting that he wants to kind of, at the same time as he is very dedicated to, scientific inquiry and explanation, at the same time he also feels that this moral component isn't just an ethical dimension, but it actually makes you a better doctor, even in terms of your analysis and your insight. But I just want to sort of end with his final kind of conclusions about what we might think of as the social ethics and social mission of a physician, reflecting in his time on Islamicate society of the 8th, 9th century in places like Baghdad or Mosul or Damascus or Cairo of the time. He says, as in his conclusion, he says that it is well known that some people are poor and some wealthy. The benefactor, the blessed, the exalted, meaning God, has shown regard for the possessor of wealth while preferring to plant sympathy and justice in their hearts and minds for the poor. For this reason, it is necessary for the wealthy person on whom God has bestowed his benefits, and for the physician whom God has ennobled, that they use justice for the poor and weak, so that the benefit of the medical art be general and in common for both the strong and the weak. The method of justice of the physician and its beginning is that it is necessary to be good, training oneself and taking care of it by employing good morals and actions with sympathy, mercy, and actually he has a very profound elsewhere discussion of mercy, how it's an absolutely vital quality of the physician. And he says that can only come from God. God has put mercy in your hearts, and a physician must tap into that. It must be a merciful person. Gentleness, chastity, courage, generosity, being just, retaining a secret. Okay, so confidentiality. Even then, they knew that patients are going to tell you a lot of things about themselves, in the course of your attempt to diagnose them and help them, and you must retain and preserve those secrets. And it's especially important, he says elsewhere in this book, if you are attending sovereigns and rulers, that you not divulge things about what you learn from them to even the people who serve them in government, because this could be used against them. And, this is an era, of course, as I said, where you don't have a very organized state, apparatus. What you have are rulers, and the person of the ruler is, in fact, crucial and central to public order and governance. So, concerns, doubts, rumors, suspicions that the sovereign is unhealthy or suffering, malady, these are very politically significant and important pieces of knowledge. And a physician, because everybody depends so much on them when they are vulnerable, when they are in moments of their greatest weakness, they are going to divulge all kinds of things about themselves, and that is a responsibility of the physician to guard those secrets. And anything like these as the virtues of the soul and its proper cultivation with work, acquiring the arts, studying its books and their meanings so as to practice them and to bestow the benefits on all people without distinguishing them as to friend or foe, in agreement or disagreement. And he goes on to talk about how it's an important responsibility of the wealthy to provide and support the physician so that the physician doesn't take patients on the basis of whether they can afford the care or not. So, okay, this is before you have a public health system, a public kind of, health insurance or national health service, but he's already grappling with the problem that everyone deserves to be treated with the best medical care. And this is, for him, in the way he imagines it, only going to be possible if physicians are supported by the wealthy and the powerful who have the means, so that they don't depend so fully on every patient paying them, and that they can excuse the fees or take lower fees for those who need it, right? This is very important for him to have this social ethics of medicine and health as something that belongs to everyone. And so he says, this is important that the wealthy do that, and that when they do not carry out justice, as we have mentioned, then it's necessary that the physician ask for assistance in various other ways. If he must engage in another vocation to gain his coin, then he must turn aside from his medicine. He thinks this is not a good outcome. This is, a problem if they have to do that. But if you have to do it, then you must do that because you need to support yourself and continue to provide the service. Okay, so with that, I just want to say that then he, kind of concludes, with a prayer. May God, with his nobility and generosity, forward us and you to the most virtuous, noble rank. To him, it alone is enough for us. Okay, so that's his conclusion. And I will stop there with his kind of wise words at the end that seriously grounded, the highest standard of medical ethics with also a kind of spiritual and faithful orientation in a social mission, that the responsibility of the physician is to provide health, even if it makes you unpopular. He says this all the time. You're going to tell people things they don't want to hear, that they shouldn't be eating these tasty, greasy, salty foods or a lot of sugary, sweets and so on. They're not going to like you, but you have to persist and encourage people to restrain their desires for the sake of their health, right? Okay, so that's a responsibility, I would say. It's something all medical students could learn as well. Your job is not just to treat the narrow symptoms and underlying physical conditions, but they are to promote health, for everyone, to make and improve society. thanks so much. I'm happy to discuss more and answer questions that might come from the audience here and online. But thank you so much for your patience. Okay, great. There's a question in the back. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, when it comes to pieces of literature like this, which obviously is from so long ago, I'm wondering how does one as a historian evaluate the impact of such a piece of literature on the day-to-day within that time? Because I wonder, if I am to write something now and share a bunch of opinions, how does somebody 1,000 years from now know that it wasn't just a Word document on my computer versus something that people actively believed in and kind of followed? So I'm just wondering how the historical approach to evaluating impactful work goes.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question because while he was known, not a lot was known about him. There are two main compendiums of what are called tabaqat, or biographical dictionaries, that were dedicated to studying the lives, biographies, education, talking about the bibliography and works that they produced, the experience they had of previous physicians. And they're from essentially the 13th century, late 12th, one of them, and the 13th century. One is Ibn al-Qifti's Tarikh al-Hukama, so the history of the wise people, but also Hakim means a doctor, and it shows again the association between a physician and a philosophical or wise person, somebody who has wisdom. That's one. And then the other is Ibn Abi Usaybi's kind of famous text, Uyun al-Anba fi Tabaqat at-Tibba, so the sources of information or knowledge or news on the classes or categories of the physicians. These are Arabic books from the 13th century that talk about famous previous physicians. He's mentioned in Ibn Abi Usaybi as an author who wrote two other treatises. Ibn al-Ruhawi also mentions in this book, Kitab, adab, al-tabib, having written another book about going into more detail about why and how you should examine, putting in the kind of licensing, you might say, practice for physicians. So it's hard to know whether he was really a very prominent physician during his time. And also, one other point is that up until now, I haven't done an incredibly exhaustive or extensive examination of how many copies, for example, of his treatise there were. When this translation was made, about 40 or 50, maybe more, it's maybe from, I can't remember if it's from the 1950s, 1967. So it's a very old translation. At that time, there was only one. Well, I actually did read another article earlier this week from maybe 2-3 years ago, and it does seem that there is only one known copy of this text. Okay, now, it's 1,000 and more years. A lot of things get lost, etc. This one happened to have been preserved and copied later. It's in the Süleymaniye Kütüphanesi in Istanbul, the Süleymaniye collection established by Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent, and because it's only existing in one treatise and we don't know him that well, and he's not somebody like Ibn Sina, al-Farabi, famous doctors who everybody knew and ended up studying their works, it's hard to know how authoritative he was. But what I will say is that he seems very steeped in what was known at the time of the Galenic and Hippocratic tradition. And he quotes constantly from Galen and, Hippocrates from works that were translated. Sometimes they're not actually Galen's works or Hippocrates, they're attributed to them, but he knows the corpus clearly of the time, and he's quoting and dealing with those. So I think it's not clear how influential he was, but later works don't give a lot of advice that runs counter to what he said, right? So that shows that even if his own treatise didn't get circulated that widely, perhaps, can't know, that the kinds of advice and the tradition in which he was working in gets continued by other doctors who are well known and that we know. Well, people like Ibn Khaldun mentions, kind of similar principles when he talks in his al-Muqaddimah about the classes he talks about different crafts and professions, and one of which is about doctors, and he mentions many things that are similarly mentioned by excuse me, this writer. So I can't be completely definitive, but I would say he reflects his time and the tradition pretty well. Now, I forgot at the time, I don't know if this is a question that may come up, but I didn't come back to the question of whether he was Jewish, Christian, what kind of Christian if he was, Muslim, did he convert to Islam, was he born a Muslim? Like these kinds of questions, scholars have taken different positions on this. There's a bit of evidence, the one manuscript that I mentioned that still exists of his work that's preserved in the Suleymaniya library, apparently, according to Muhammad Ghali, who wrote this article a few years ago, and it's pretty comprehensive about Ruhawi's work, and this treatise mentions that his full name is given in this copy of his text as Ishaq ibn Ali. What was it? It was I should have written it down, but it was al-Yahudi, I forget. There was another modifier that is associated with the Jews of the Jazira, of the Arabian Peninsula. Obviously, he's not living there, but it's like of kunya, of like he's from a family from there. But this was actually also crossed out, by a later person saying, "Oh no, that's incorrect," and so we don't actually know anything definitive about what his religion was. Throughout the treatise, he talks about Allah. He doesn't do a lot of quoting of Quran, but he always talks about the divine books and the divine laws, kind of generally. And what I would say and what I would argue is that clearly, in some ways, it didn't matter. In a society where your religious identity was extremely important in indicating what community you were part of and so on, nonetheless, when it came to the profession of physicians and the path of studying knowledge of medicine, science, philosophy, astronomy, astrology, astronomy, mathematics. Well, I should say astrology because they were often combined, just as alchemy and chemistry were also not clearly distinguished during this period. But if you were following the path of knowledge, as I said, it was a project that could be cross-confessional. And so in some ways, it doesn't really matter. And this tells us a lot about that society, that it wasn't necessary to pin this person down as long as they continued to uphold high standards for knowledge and high ethics that were grounded in faith. Didn't matter if he was Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, as long as he believed there is a creator, you are responsible to that creator in your formation, in your behavior, and your ethics, and you need to learn and study, to the best of your capacity, then you could be a good doctor, right? But if you ignored any of those things, then you wouldn't be, right? So he's very clear in some sense of a conception that could cut across the different religious communities and, integrate people of diverse backgrounds into, a kind of multi-religious kind of project of social knowledge, of social and scientific knowledge. Yeah.
This kind of moral paradigm, it's so unique to us living in this day and age. I wonder whether this way of thinking was reflected in the conduct of doctors in the wider Muslim world, or even in the earlier, later centuries in different parts of the world.
I do think that it has always varied, could vary in different societies at different times. Very often in my research and teaching, I like to point out to people that in many, many ways, people living 1,000 years ago were a lot more open-minded and tolerant than many of us today. We come with a lot of presumptions. We think we're very advanced and very tolerant, etc. But the number of wars, the kind of rise of bigotry, the prejudices that we see, maybe people always had them. Excuse me. But in the past, they had neither the social, nor the technical, nor the, excuse me, political means of enforcing those bigotries or prejudices. Apologies. I'm giving a talk about medicine, but I've been suffering from a cold the last couple of weeks, sorry. Sorry for people here and on the stream because I didn't mute the mic, so. So there's more that one could say about that, but I think the point is that this was a surprisingly diverse society, right? With people finding ways to cooperate and collaborate, and with high level of intimacy and knowledge of one another. And sometimes that might be surprising for us because we think people in the medieval era were much less, knowledgeable or advanced than we are today, supposedly. And I guess what I would say is the societies are different. What's possible and what's not possible, what's allowable, what's not allowable, might range and vary over time. But what's important really in this kind of context is to appreciate that people from a distant past are just as human, just as complex as we are, right? They may have lived in a different world, but when you study history, it's a very important principle to accord the subjects that you're studying with the same humanity you have for yourself, right? And think about them as just as complex in their time. They may have known less about some aspects of how the world worked. They may have had less access to technical means for achieving their goals, etc., but it doesn't render them any less human. Right? So that's, I think, important. And something that I'm always reminded by when I read a text like this and I see the differences, how different the world was, but also how there were similarly kind of complex and sophisticated commitments, to, what we think is most important. Why are you all, studying to be doctors? I mean, I think you always start with the idea that it's because you want to help people, right? And that's something that's as much committed at that time. And that's a wonderful thing to see that, across 1,000 years of history, to kind of recognize that kinship, that there is a similar dedication. How that happens and all of that, they may have lots of different ideas than the way, people would think about it today. But, that kind of ethical commitment to serving humanity has been part of the profession, for all this time. Yeah.
very insightful. The question I kind of had for you, you mentioned previously when you mentioned that oftentimes that those who were doctors back then, they were also involved or they studied other disciplines.
Yes.
So sometimes they're mathematicians, sometimes they were like something else. I guess I just kind of wanted to ask you, you mentioned these disciplines also complement each other.
Mm-hmm.
My first question is how do they complement each other? And my second question is like, what do you think were the forces behind why this isn't the case today?
Excuse me. Yeah, excellent question. Well, the way that they were integrated and could be seen as part of a unity was that there was a kind of broad physics and metaphysics, right, that was described in, these kind of philosophical treatises and writing that organized knowledge as branches. There's fundamental things, and then there are sort of, there's roots, requirements, logic, math is sort of fundamental, kind of logic and language, right? And because those are the building blocks for thinking, for expressing, and so on. And then there's study of the natural world, music, and its harmonies was thought to be a subdiscipline of mathematics, okay? And if you actually study music theory, you can see why. Is because there are these kind of numeric, arithmetic kinds of means and, the sound systems, of notes and everything follows very regular kind of mathematical patterns. And so they recognized that there was a kind of kinship between, music and math, things that we think of as just completely separate disciplines, right? So that's an illustration of ways in which they saw that all of these different forms of knowledge were different specifications of a kind of modern, common metaphysics of the nature of the universe and the nature of matter and spirit, right? And the way that those two things, went together. So they had a much more holistic and integrative way of studying these things and a kind of plan in the curriculum that you start with these kind of fundamental questions and then you might specialize. But because your formation was based on a broader foundation, you had kind of knowledge of these other disciplines in order to be good even in your specialty. It would be built upon foundations that came in other things that we would consider separate disciplines housed in separate parts of the university, for example, and as, different modes of research. And so in some sense, when leaders of our university, for example, talk about the need for interdisciplinarity and that we need to have kind of new programs that could actually put engineers in relation to kind of social scientists who study kind of the conditions in say in Africa. If you want to do a kind of water purification project, you should know perhaps something about the society that you'll be working with so that you can figure out cooperative ways for this project to be successful and so on. They think this is, something extremely new and innovative to actually have these disciplines talk to one another, whereas I think of this as a very old idea that for some reason we departed from, but that we could all continue to learn from one another in crossing these disciplines. And the idea that, a good, like just as we were sort of saying in some ways, being a good doctor, especially if you're one who works with patients rather than just in the more kind of technical dimensions, say radiology and anesthesiology and so on. But if you actually have to work with, diagnose, and treat patients, having some sense of psychology might indeed really be helpful, because you need the patients to trust you, to tell you about their symptoms. He's very clear, al-Ruhawi, he said, don't ignore anything a patient says, because you might learn something that will give you a clue into what the malady is, diagnosing it, figuring out a treatment, or why some treatments will work for one person but won't for others because of their, kind of conditions of life, etc. So similarly, when you go into the clinical treatment room, having kind of a rounded sense of psychology, of social kind of ethics, etc., can be very useful in making you a better kind of physician. So it seems to me it's only natural to think of these forms of knowledge as actually, interrelating in some way, right? Because fundamentally, and this is something I think is what's so profound about the adab al-tabib, is that whatever you are doing, whether you're a doctor, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a teacher, a nurse, an engineer, you are also a human being, and you work in a world that is social. And so you have to be able to incorporate and integrate these things. The worst engineers are the ones who never think about how this will impact like the society around the project that they're doing or something like that, right? So as a result, it just seems to me having a more integrated sense, cross-disciplinary interrelations is just the best way, to develop real knowledge, because knowledge is not just an abstract. It's something that has to be applied in the world, and this world is, social and as well as physical. So I think that's how I would try and go about that kind of a question. And so, in fact, actually, all of them were not even just. It wasn't just that some of them were good at not only being a doctor, but also other things. Almost all of them were trained at a very high level in numerous disciplines. And so somebody like al-Biruni wrote a book about mathematics, but he was also a very famous physician. He also wrote, very interestingly and importantly, he studied astronomy as well, and he theorized, this is in the 10th century, late 9th and 10th century, he theorized that the Ptolemaic geocentric system had some real problems. And he said, well, here's 9 scenarios in which we could try and rectify the gap between our observations of the movement of heavenly bodies and the Ptolemaic system that requires everything to work in perfect concentric circles of orbits with the Earth at the center. He said the actual observations don't show that that's how it works. How can we resolve this contradiction? He came up with 9 scenarios in which we might attempt to correct the Ptolemaic system. And one of them, he says, is, if you put the sun at the center, this all works out a lot better. The math works a lot better. It fits with the observations. So hundreds of years before Galileo and Copernicus decided that, yes, it is that we are in a heliocentric system, he's at least theorizing that it's the case. This is somebody who's also a doctor, a mathematician. He also wrote a book about knowledge in India. These were what are called polymaths, people who, were very gifted and knowledgeable in what we think of as multiple disciplines, but they just considered that was being educated. And we can learn a lot from just trying to be better educated, I think, in that way. So thank you so much for that. It's so relevant to what's happening now at the university, where it's like, STEM, you must have STEM, and, let's get rid of the humanities and the social sciences because they're not very useful, they're not practical, but, maybe there's some way that these could be better integrated together for training and educating everybody better in the same way that, if you're a humanities person, but you don't understand the first thing about, gravity and physical aspects of the world, that's not going to be helpful. You're going to write like a fiction story where everything's out of whack. How can you do science fiction? You want to be a literature person, but if you don't have any grasp of science, it's not going to be the best, kind of work. So it just seems to me that we could be a lot more integrative and inclusive in our approach, I think, to knowledge today. Yeah, there was some other.
Yeah, just continuing on what you were saying and what Dr. Hussein was saying. I think as well now, we don't see maybe all of these different subjects in an individual, but within hospitals and medical settings, we now see these roles. And, I have a bit of a different background. I have, some social work education. I worked in personal care. Is that hospitals and medical settings, you'll be working with social workers, members of the clergy are there. And so I think maybe it's what you said is that there was a departure maybe from that, but that now it's coming back in the form of like a healthcare team.
Yeah.
Right. Where maybe all of that responsibility is on your shoulders. Because when I'm hearing the text, a lot of that code of conduct is very similar to what you're taught in social work and in personal care work. Much maybe even more so than, we have our rules and for particular situations and things like that. But, who you are as a person and how you conduct yourself in public and all of these things are much, I think, more common in the social work setting. So,
Yeah.
It's about working as a team, I think, with those individuals who maybe are trained more specifically in that knowledge, because it is very difficult to, these individuals historically, to become a physician, you had to have such a high level of education. And with less individuals being of such high education, they were, I think, trusted with more. Whereas now with more specialization and with more people who are educated, we can, as I said, we can defer some of those responsibilities to a group of people who are taking care of the patients, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, maybe this is coming back. There are a lot of benefits of specialization, okay? Like the advance of knowledge and research, it obviously had certain kinds of benefits, but it perhaps needed to be reintegrated in a more holistic way. And having a team, maybe now the forms of knowledge are so rigorous, extensive, that one person can't be an al-Biruni and Avicenna, Ibn Sina, etc., and be a polymath. Like, it's just too difficult, the amount that you have to learn and study. But being able to know enough to be able to interface and get the benefit of other specialists in other fields to work collectively as a team, that's maybe a more modern way of doing that kind of integration. So I think that's a great, kind of point. And I just also did want to say, I didn't give this example because time was, I'd gone on for a long time. And I wanted to hear your questions and thoughts, but there was just to kind of underscore that point of the multi-religious character of this kind of culture, social world and culture of learning. He tells us, and maybe, I don't know if this is a clue to his own religious identity. And as I say, I think in some ways, clearly, maybe that wasn't the most important. He could have been any of those things and it still would have made sense. But he tells a story about Harun al-Rashid going on pilgrimage. So again, very famous and important Abbasid Caliph ruler in the late 8th and early 9th centuries in the Common Era, went on the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca. And he said to Jibril ibn Bukht Yashu, who was a famous physician, not a Muslim, said, "O Jibril, I accepted your rank by my side and prayed to Allah for you in the sacred place," meaning in Mecca. When he was there at the Kaaba, he prayed for Jibril ibn Bukht Yashu. And the sons of Hashim, that is the people, the Quraysh, the residents of Mecca, said, "What are you doing? Hey, he's not, they raised some kind of like quizzical, why are you, praying for a non-Muslim? You've come all the way on the Hajj, your Muslim religious obligation, pray for, people who will really appreciate it, maybe, is what they were saying." But they said, he's not a Muslim, right? And Harun al-Rashid said, "Yes, but the health and maintenance of my body is on his account. And the goodness of the Muslim ummah as a whole is on my account." So as the caliph, as the ruler, the commander of the faithful, so their good, meaning of all the Muslims, is, because of him and his life, like what he does for me is enabling me to serve the Muslims. So whether he's Muslim or not, he's performing a absolutely necessary and crucial function for maintaining society as a whole. And so then the people of Mecca, the Hashimi, said, "You're correct, O commander of the believers. You're right." Okay, so we shouldn't raise that objection about what you were doing by honoring and praying for your physician who was not a Muslim. They said, "You're right. He's doing the most important work. He's keeping you healthy, and you're guarding and preserving the whole empire on behalf of the health of all." Right. So, I think that's just a really nice way of observing that it was possible at that time to really see the value of others outside of your own faith community, which may be surprising to many people who have this impression and this image of contemporary Islam and Muslim society of being intolerant, or what we see happening in our societies today, where there's so much, kind of bigotry, racism, and so forth, is that, we could take in a way a lesson from the people of the 9th century, Baghdad, and actually learn a thing or two about how to be human with one another. Yeah.
Thank you for your thought. I think you mentioned that the author of the treatise was involved also in philosophy to an extent. Was there any evidence that you found of him engaging with the works of some of the Greek philosophers other than Hippocrates, such as Plato, Aristotle, and their ideas in regards to philosophy and just kind of even in religion?
Well, yeah. I mean, he seems aware of a number of them, and he quotes and mentions Plato, Aristotle, a number of others. It's not clear, how specifically or extensively, given that this was a treatise about the physician, and so it was narrowly cast to, the proper conduct and best practices and education and duties and responsibilities of that community. But it's clear that he values philosophy. He tries to sort of suggest and argue, however, that the physician, that many people would say to him, "Oh, look, the philosophers are, more important, because isn't the soul more important than the body? And the philosophers are those who give care, to the soul." And he said, "Yeah, but we do both, actually. And, without the body, then your soul, is not going to, benefit either." And so he actually tries to say that we are philosophers in a way, that the true physician is a philosopher. So he sees the social role. And we have to think of philosophy not about just abstract thinking. It was a way of being in the world, a kind of practice. His point is that you're going to have to advise people to do, much like Socrates. I think he has this kind of thing in mind. Socrates had to tell people, as a true philosopher, things that they didn't want to hear, that were critical of, and encouraging them not to give into, what they would call baser instincts and pleasures that might actually not be good for you. So, like, for example, in the dialogue on the Gorgias, you have Socrates saying, there's a difference between medicine and, kind of cookery. And this is because, a cook will flatter the pleasures of the body by giving food that is tasty, but maybe not healthful, whereas the physician is going to counsel that you eat and drink in moderation and things that are healthy for you. And people don't want to be told that. They want to have, their salty, fatty, kind of food, even though if it's going to kill them. And you, as a physician, and Socrates was basically saying a philosopher is doing the same thing, is having to advise people in this sort of way. So I think there's such parallels for somebody like this. They're so steeped in a kind of study of philosophy that it suffuses the general framework of their approach to knowledge. So even though in this treatise he doesn't go into extensive discussions about Aristotle's views or Plato's views, they're part of the kind of necessary background of the physics and metaphysics that integrates the forms of knowledge that they have been trained in. So yes, he's definitely aware of them. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk again. Just had a question when you mentioned that the adab kind of contested the idea of biomedical ethics being drawn from Sharia and Sharia law
Yeah.
specifically. And they mentioned it's beyond just treating an illness, but looking at things from a preventative approach,
Yeah.
considering social context. Why has there been maybe such a delay in Western medicine adopting the same approach when something like that had already been invented or innovated centuries before?
Well, I mean, I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm not, a historian of science to be able to, really explain, I think, adequately. But what I would point to is, I think, transformations that take place in the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution and capitalism and big science. Like, his whole point is you shouldn't practice this because it's going to be rewarding materially for you. The kind of science that is done and is increasingly being done is where it can be seen to be applied for the purposes of commercializing the knowledge, right? That doesn't lead to the best science. And it also tends to abstract those outside of its consequences for the rest of society, because capitalism's whole point, the way it can make a profit, is by privatizing the gains and socializing all of the risks and consequences to everybody else and not factoring it into the actual cost of something. The actual cost of something is very high. All of the pollution, all of the exploitated labor, etc. If you actually, put in all of the costs, it would be much, much higher, and there would be no profit, or there wouldn't be as much profit. And the whole point is to pursue and use knowledge in such a way to maximize profit rather than other goals that might be available or possible, like social benefit or utility. And for somebody like this operating in this time, their whole point is to encourage the use of science, of learning, of knowledge for human benefit. That's the primary goal. And he says you must not go into this for the sake of material gain. And you must not kind of flatter the wealthy clients. In fact, actually, he's insisting that there's an ethics that if you want to benefit from the value of this knowledge of physicians, you wealthy and powerful people, you have to support so that this benefit can be made more collective, common, and general to all of society. So he clearly has a different kind of social ethical paradigm. And so if science is pursued in a way with the specialization, with these kind of methods that don't then consider and integrate it into social ethics, you will get an increasing divorce between, this kind of holistic sort of viewpoint, but and the advance of technical aspects, which will have great benefits potentially, if they're balanced by being reintegrated with an ethical or social goals and objectives and making those the priorities rather than, for example, the commercializing of this knowledge and to maximize profit and so on. If it's meant for social benefit and social utility, not as just a side outcome potentially, but rather as the primary goal, then we might have more opportunity to reintegrate these different components. So that's kind of a short answer of what I think is at the root of what has changed in the way that we pursue knowledge. Knowledge as instrumental for, maximizing profit rather than knowledge that is of social benefit. Yeah. If there's no other first timers, we can come to another. Yeah, go ahead.
I thought that was an amazing question as well. It immediately drew me back to the quote from the beginning. What is the role of the physician? It's to provide the healing that, through Allah, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you read in the Christian context, if you're reading, say, Gospel of Mark, or any of the Gospels, Jesus' healing is seen in a much different manner. The casting out of unclean spirits is often what it's called. Demonic possession, and there's a really big emphasis placed on healing through Jesus. And I think that if you have centuries of people reading this text and following, say, a massive institution such as the Catholic Church, who maybe has a other priority on why they want people to come to them for healing, it is, maybe this is controversial, but inherently less scientific in a way, right? Because it takes away a little bit of the agency of the individual. And this is just an argument, or an opinion, I should say. But I think there's an issue there at the root as well of the understanding of how healing comes about. Maybe.
Well, in this context, I think, what New quoted at the outset is something that he would incorporate. He obviously thinks that there's, physical basis for, the healing, that the doctor engages in their treatments, and that's, the reason why the healing, happens. But he is also at the same time does assert that, this is, in fact, actually he tries to ground that this is, in fact, he says in the book that this is a gift from God that has been given to humanity. So maybe the knowledge has been given as a gift from God, and the physicians implement and use it for pious purposes of helping humanity heal the sick and maintain health. Again, preventive care is really important for him. But for him, those two go together. They're not separate sorts of things. Yeah.
Question from chat.
Oh, great.
Yeah, this was asked by Zara. So she was asking that recognizing the duty of physicians, especially as Muslims, to social justice and benefiting from population health, how may we take action to better support our patients? Capitalism can oftentimes sustain the social determinants of health and health inequities. And I wonder how we as physicians can have a positive impact when recognizing the limitations of our systems.
Well, that's a good question for discussion for all of you who are actually connected with the medical profession, are engaged in learning and studying and thinking about, how can you operate in this system that, at least it's a public insurance system, that does foreground a goal of providing a standard of health for society. But there's so many inequities that are systemic. It's very difficult, as an individual to think, what is your ethical kind of commitment to, and how can you express that effectively in this profession? That's really more a question for all of you who would be better able to answer it, I think, than me, but it's a very important question. Excuse me. Okay. Well, thank you all so much, and sorry, thank you for bearing with me. My voice is stretched to the limit here to talk for about an hour and a half, but I've really enjoyed it, and I want to thank you for the invitation because it's given me an opportunity to investigate an area of Islamic culture that I hadn't really specialized in, and I hope to continue and learn more about it. So I thank you for this opportunity.
We're so glad to hear all this really amazing information. I was really engaged throughout the whole time. And I just want to conclude with hopefully an inspiring quote that it's a hadith that مثل أمتي كالمطر, that my ummah is like rain. لا يدرى أوله أم آخر, that you don't know if the beginning of the rain is the best or the end is the best. This is a like Sahih hadith that has been authenticated by external evidence, but it is something like, there are amazing people in the past, but that doesn't mean we can't be amazing in the future. So that's, I think, a good one.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a wonderful way to end and conclude. So thank you again, and salam alaikum to you all here and to people online, either in the Zoom or on the various platforms. And I do just want to say, if you're interested, I do have a podcast called Guerrilla History that I do with another co-host, Henry Hakamaki, and I also have a channel on my own on YouTube that you can listen to as a podcast or watch the videos. And we're trying to do different kinds of things, including studying history. I have a series called The Names of God, which is about the Asma al-Husna. We're really at the beginning. I do it with a colleague and a dear friend. We will be doing Ar-Rahman soon. We just did Allah, right? So we're really at the start of the 99 names. That might be a series you're interested in, so please do check it out, and other things that are on the channel. Maybe you'll find it beneficial, inshallah. So, Jazakallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.